look to them as time passes, you know. It's just hard. It's hard to periodize the recent past. Are we filming?
Yeah.
This right now? Oh, okay.
We'll decide later whether we use it or not.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, well, that, you know, I totally fetishize archival footage for that reason, and I think stuff from the recent past will have that kind of, I don't know, that intrigue to it in the future.
And do you think of like period specificity as far as the technology you use to, like, especially with your reenactments, like what you're going to shoot on for that period?
Yeah, I mean, I really like tracing footsteps, and that also, I do that in a production way too. So like tracing the footsteps of what a camera person, or even just an individual, an amateur filmmaker at the time would have. So for like Wild Combination, we used all these VHS kind of camcorders and Super 8, and for this film it was a lot more elaborate in terms of kind of identifying what 16 millimeter looked like back in those periods, and then using non-digital techniques to degrade our material so that it resembled that actual footage, because I want my recreations to look like real archival footage.
Yeah. How do you conceptualize how the viewer is perceiving it, like specifically like the technologies used? Do you think that like maybe they're not noticing it with some of them? And
the goal for me is to not jar the viewer so that they're not taken out of the film thinking about its construction, but I know that there are viewers who probably aren't aware that some of the material that I've created is archival footage. But it's not about tricking people or creating a kind of puzzle or game of what's real, what's not real, and these questions of authenticity aren't really at the center of what I'm doing. It's more just about creating a cohesive, kind of formally consistent experience in the film.
It makes me think of Edvard Munch, the Watkins film. Have you seen that?
I actually haven't seen it, but I've always wanted to see it.
Because like I wouldn't say that that's jarring or troubling, but like I think that there's an awareness, like maybe a positive awareness, like, that
I'd like the viewer to be conscious that what they're seeing is constructed, but to not be kind of distracted by the filmmaking, but for it to feel super organic. And that's why I use kind of organic techniques to degrade stuff instead of trying to achieve these looks digitally. I was really inspired by Woody Allen's film Zelig, which, you know, it's like conceptually Woody Allen's inserting his own persona into history, and it's, you know, Gordon Willis, the cinematographer, used non-digital techniques to create the look of 1920s newsreels, and super successful. And in a way, when you start watching the film, you are kind of impressed by the technique, but you, I think, quickly just accept it and watch it as a film, and there's a consistency between the newsreels that are integrated with the footage of Woody Allen, and that really inspired me for Teenage.
What about the concept of the archive? Like we keep saying archival, but like just the actual, like your interest in archives.
I'm more interested in hidden histories than I am in archives, but just the notion that there's biographies and cultural information that's not well known, and that you have to do some digging to find it, and the visual evidence is what's most useful and also most interesting to me. So yeah, I'm really interested in making the past feel contemporary and trying to find kind of resonance and ideas and material from previous generations, and so I work in archives to do that, but also I'm just aesthetically drawn to archival photographs and found footage and material.
And with Teenage, is that kind of why the soundtrack is so contemporary? Both the score and the soundtrack?
Yeah, I mean, that was just the overall premise of the film, is take archival footage from the past and combine it with contemporary music, and it transforms the material so that a flapper girl who's dancing feels like someone who's dancing today, except the kind of styles and signifiers are different. And every time I tried putting period-appropriate music in a traditional way to that footage, it felt very like grandma, like this is my grandparents' music or my great-grandparents' music, and that defeats the idea of the film, which is to make the old feel new and to make these past histories feel present. And so, yeah, I always knew that would be a huge part of the film, and also just that music would play wall to wall throughout the film. Almost all the archival footage is silent, and I think of the film almost like a record where you listen to it and you can let it just kind of wash over you and have an experience with it, or you can listen to the narration almost like lyrics to music, and that can deepen and enhance the ideas and experience of the film, obviously. So it's meant to be a very musical experience.
And what was the relationship like with Bradford Cox?
Bradford didn't compose music to picture. He worked in a really concentrated period and made a huge body of original music. And then I worked with my editor to kind of find the right home for these cues. And Bradford, there's a little bit of back and forth with Bradford. And then sound design played a big part in terms of like creating and integrating all of the different musical components. Like, there's a lot of kind of musical elements in the sound design, and sometimes period music does kind of filter in, but almost like a dream. It kind of like phases in and out of the contemporary music. So that was a huge aspect of sound design, to kind of make the score feel like one complete soundscape.
And the soundtrack, the tracks used kind of oscillate through time. Like there's like the wire stuff, there's the more contemporary electro.
Initially the concept was to have Bradford make everything, but it became not feasible because there's such a range of music in the film, and it was becoming just a little like kind of monotonous to have one kind of musical kind of point of view driving the entire film. His music makes up the majority of the film's soundtrack, but I liked mashing up the periods a little bit with the music. I don't know if all viewers will recognize the krautrock or some of the kind of post-punk stuff that's in there, but it helped create a kind of range and movement in the tone of the film too, to do that.
And what was the decision? Like, this was an adaptation, right? So how was that process of adapting something into a kind of doc? I mean, it's a strong adaptation. It's really inspired by Jon's book more than based on, in the sense that his book covers a much larger range of material. It's from 1845 to 1945 to chart the prehistory of the teenager. He also covered some stories in France, and our film telescoped into America, England, and Germany. It starts at 1904, it ends at 1945. And really, the guiding force in terms of deciding what storylines to tell is what could we find archival footage of. I didn't want to tell the story if there was one image for it. Everything needed to have a strong basis in real archival footage. And a big feature in Jon's book are the biographies of individual teenagers, and that was one of my favorite parts of his book, but we chose to kind of zero in on 4 characters, and they provide a kind of composite portrait of the teenager that's about to be born and represent different kind of periods and genders and classes and races and experiences and types. And that's a real departure from Jon's book, because I wanted to take this kind of sweeping cultural history and to create emotional beats within it that allowed for a different kind of experience for the viewer. And that's where I use the recreations. Yeah, and there's like, they kind of rhyme with that autobiography as opposed to biography, because the voiceover for those characters tends to be, it's personal pronouns.
Yeah. And those characters that are the subject of the recreations, they're real people, and they are themselves kind of hidden histories. They're unknown figures, and they're all derived from real books and diaries. So, Brenda Dean Paul, the 1920s flapper, she wrote an autobiography called My First Life. And the Bright Young Things in England are pretty well known. Cecil Beaton, Stephen Tennant, but she was a lesser known figure. And her story felt very contemporary to me. She seems like a kind of Lindsay Lohan figure. A woman who's obsessed with paparazzi attention, who kind of has a public demise because of drugs, and people love to hate and moralize and judge. And so that's where she came from. Melita Mashman is a big part of Jon's book, and she wrote just an incredibly chilling autobiography called Account Rendered, which describes how she kind of became absorbed into fascism. And it was that really inspired me, because so much of the Hitler Youth imagery focuses on these kind of hypnotic and mesmerizing images of the masses. I just thought it was really important to kind of root that in the experience and emotional logic of an individual. And then Tommy Scheel was like a super inspiring story to me. He's a German swing kid who used American music and British fashion to rebel against the Nazi regime. And I knew I wanted to do that one, but for all these characters, I wanted there to be not only my recreations, but also real archival footage. And it was a real challenge to find archival footage of German swing kids, but we did. And Yeah, to me, Tommy's story, this German swing kid, it's kind of the colliding of the two themes of the film, the kind of political unrest and the significance of teenage rebellion in a political context, and then just kids being kids, party culture, having fun, innovating new style, loving music. These kind of collide in Tommy's story, where just as being just a normal kid and celebrating kind of popular culture, he's also being a courageous political activist. And then finally, Warren Wall's our fourth character. He's an African-American Boy Scout. It was really, really hard to represent the experiences and stories of youth of color from this period because they just were excluded from the official record. There aren't newsreels about African-American life. But we kind of struck gold when we found some amazing unedited footage of Harlem from the 1940s. And then Warren is a very small part of Jon's book, but there was an anthropologist, or excuse me, a sociologist who in the 1940s wrote a book called Negro Youth at the Crossroads. And within it was this lengthy interview with an African-American teenager, and it was a really vivid and poignant depiction of what it would be like to be a black teenager during World War II, which was a very racist time. And I was really inspired to bring Warren to life, but unlike the other characters who are kind of more extreme or flamboyant personalities, he's kind of like an ordinary kid who's just trying to do good in school and do well by his parents to succeed, but he's hampered by the prejudices of the era. And I found that to make him an extraordinary person, even though his kind of lifestyle was pretty ordinary. So these were the kind of four characters that I thought kind of, when pieced together, form this new model of youth, the teenager. So
with the hidden histories, it seems like that's an aspect of the film, and also the more visible history of what is available in the archive that you're mentioning. Like sometimes they don't cross over. And I'm curious where you feel the film positions itself in relation to the avant-garde's hidden history films, like that has a tradition there, versus like the more visible tradition of even something like
Ken Burns.
Or I was going to say even Leni Riefenstahl, which is kind of in the canon. So those images we kind of understand when they come up.
Well, the film is an essay film, and that does have an avant-garde tradition from Chris Marker to more recently Johan Grimenprez and also the British essayist Adam Curtis, whose films I love. And in my work, I kind of do like to use some kind of experimental filmmaking strategies, although I am trying to also engage in storytelling, and the work is designed to reach a broad audience on television and in movie theaters. So I kind of walk that line in my work. I think Teenage could have been a much more abstract film that provided less context, although some people perceive it as a very abstract film, despite it having its own narrative and aiming to create a cultural history that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, rather than, say, a film installation in a museum or gallery. And in terms of the kind of conventions of historical filmmaking, to me it was two choices. You could make a film that kind of explains the cultural history and uses archival footage to illustrate fairly literally the ideas and history that's being kind of explained. Or I could use archival footage to express ideas, and I definitely went the more expressionistic route with the film. So I think it's very difficult to go, I am in an in-between space with it, but it's very difficult. It's kind of, you need these kind of experts and historians providing context, explaining everything, to have your kind of traditional multi-part television series. And my film is kind of more dreamlike, and it's really experienced from the headspace of a teenager. I always had a kind of formal concept in that this film is so much about the way that society and adults speak about and discuss youth, and about young people kind of rising in terms of their ability to define themselves. And much of the archival footage, such as newsreels, has adult voices explaining in an authoritative way what youth are doing. And I wanted to strike a kind of dichotomy or tension with the actual voices of teenagers who were narrating their own experience and seeing history unfold from their own point of view. So that kind of generational disconnect is in some ways conceptualized in the form of the film. But in terms of someone like Leni Riefenstahl, she really uses the techniques of narrative filmmaking, tracking shots and experiments with depth of field and heroic composition, Her films are intoxicating, they're mesmerizing, and really most of the imagery of the Hitler Youth is mesmerizing. I think some of the essay films I mentioned, such as Adam Curtis, take on some of the conventions of propaganda, except for an alternative kind of political perspective rather than a nationalistic or fascist point of view. And you know, I don't think my film is really agitprop for teenagers, but I suppose it has a kind of empowering design to it that could have it could make a teenager feel kind of inspired to you know, participate civically in some way, but it's not designed in the way to really propagate some sort of message. It's a lot looser than that. At least that was my intention.
Well, I think the recreations speak to that. Like even I'm thinking of Barbara Hammer or filmmakers who have engaged in specifically queer hidden histories tend to employ that device. So that's also a kind of, it draws attention to what's not seen because it has to be recreated. It was not covered at the time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is a lot of the histories in this film are, you know, unfamiliar because they're marginalized. You know, like the experience of an African American Boy Scout is marginalized from the, you know, definitive early 20th century history. I think filmmakers and historians do a great job at kind of reimagining, or not reimagining, but kind of reassessing what these histories are and adding more perspectives to them. But I'm personally drawn to kind of the teenagers who worked against the grain, whether they were the kind of bright young people who were dressing up in drag and making home movies of themselves in the 1920s, or the German swing kids who were kind of using music to express their politics. So I think my preference for kind of the outsider marginalized types definitely plays out in the film.
Well, it's definitely the impetus behind Wild Combination, which is another circumstance where there's not a lot of documentation, and even at the point that it was made, reception of Arthur Russell.
Yeah.
So is that something that you see as a through line that goes through your work?
Yeah, I mean, I have made a lot of biographical films. I like working with biographies, and I'm mostly interested in queer biographies. I like telling the story of people I perceive as kind of cultural heroes who have been lost. Arthur Russell is a perfect example of that. I see him, I've kind of referred to it once somewhere as this genre of gentle gaze. Like, he just has this kind of gentle demeanor to him, but also a certain level of intensity. And I'm not really like that necessarily, but I identify with it. And in a way, I'm imagining myself as a peer to a lot of those artists, like Arthur Russell or Joe Brainard, who I've made a film about. And I definitely think the interest in queer biography is related also to my interest in hidden histories. And I think it's a generational thing too, that a lot of people from my generation, especially gay people, are really interested in rehabilitating the legacies of cultural figures from the late 80s and early 90s. And I think that a lot of young people are really interested in the past. I think it's a cornerstone of youth culture, just finding an old record, going to a thrift store, finding something that other people don't have or feels obscure and reclaiming it and making it your own. I think that's something I definitely did as a teenager, and it's something I still kind of do now in a way, and it's something my peers do, and that exchanging of information is a vital part of my life.
And there's an exchange, I guess, with you as an artist and the figures as artists, because the Arthur Russell one is a portrait of Arthur Russell, and Joe Brainard's about, like, there's a kind of understanding that you're making artistic decisions. It's not a biography. It doesn't say a biography of Arthur Russell.
Totally. I like to have agency in what I'm doing too, and I think of myself more as like an artist than a kind of journalist. And so I'm really interested in experimenting with different types of filmmaking that kind of is designed to enhance the subject matter that I'm working with. And I think with teenage, I've pushed that the furthest I've ever gone. It's interesting because when you make documentaries, oftentimes, unlike this conversation, the conversation is completely about the topic and the subject matter. And I found it's been interesting that this film premiered just 2 weeks ago, Teenage. So I've only started having these conversations, but the conversation is a lot about the filmmaking, which is interesting, possibly because the subject matter is complex and it's hard to kind of pin down. But I'm always trying to figure out ways to kind of push the conventions of documentary genre and challenging myself to imagine a kind of formal approach to my filmmaking that is kind of matches the spirit of the subject matter.
Yeah. Well, with Arthur Russell, you can, like, definitely the intro sets the tone, the credit sequence with this kind of lyrical tape being filmed in like an aquarium or something.
Yeah.
You're already understanding that this is going to be a more artistic
kind of
treatment than,
yeah. And I think like, it's interesting. Most filmmakers start from the perspective of story. Like, this is a great story. I'm going to make a film out of it. It's a great story. I'm going to tell a story well. I always start with imagery. Kind of that's my starting point. For the Arthur Russell film, it was like, I heard about this gay disco producer, avant-garde musician who would ride the Staten Island Ferry every day listening to cassettes of his own mixes. And that image was really intriguing to me. I ended up actually filming that image with an actor wearing Arthur Russell's actual clothes and a VHS camera. And that kind of tracing of footsteps or the realization of an image that really resonates with me is kind of the most exciting part of the filmmaking for me. And then I come to story later. I have to work really, really hard to develop narrative. That's not my starting point. And that's a kind of a more visual artist type approach to filmmaking, which one day hopefully I'll begin with narrative first. It's a lot easier to go that way. But I don't remember what the first image was of teenage that I was really excited about, but it probably was the German swing kid robbery. In this history, the German swing kids who were obsessed with gangster films from America took photographs of a robbery, and it was like a kind of like a conceptual art project. And we're talking like 1936 teenagers. And I filmed a recreation of it, which of anything I did film, this is something people assume is archival footage more often than not. It's a footage of someone taking pictures of another robbing a villa. And those actual photographs are really exciting to me because I remember reading about it thinking, this is like next level genius that people were doing this. And to make that image, because that image doesn't really exist, is that's what's exhilarating to me. You know, I don't always just think, oh, I have this image, this idea in my mind, I got to bring it to life. Like, I'll know about a real thing, a real image that exists that you can't see, and to bring that to life is more fascinating to me personally. That's kind of how I'm wired creatively.
That reminded me of the Joe Brainard doc, where you've kind of taken this poem, this recital of it, and then kind of pulled it back, like the camera and that, and shown the relationship with was it Rob?
Ron Padgett.
Ron, yeah. And now you have the two sitting like kind of point counterpoint.
Yeah, it's interesting with that film because a close friend gave me, I remember, I thought, this is beautiful. And then I thought, well, it could kind of make a cool film. And then I found archival audio recordings of Joe reading it, and his voice is really amazing. And I said, okay, I want to do this, but how can it not just be a nostalgia piece or an exercise in nostalgia? And then I read this biography of Joe that someone had given me for my birthday like 5 years earlier that I'd never read. And at first, it's written by Ron Padgett, who's a very well-known and well-respected poet. And at first I was reading it, and Ron's straight, and I was just like, this really feels like a straight guy kind of like looking at the life of his gay friend from the outside, and it's kind of dry. But what he was actually doing is like recording every memory he had of Joe, not in the same form, but in a kind of chronology. And I started reading it, and midway through the book, I was so emotionally engaged, just being like, this is so deep to see like a really, really vivid account of a friendship, because friendship's really important to me. I have a lot of really close friends, but it's rare to really recount the development of that, you know? And then by the end of the book, I was sobbing reading the book. It was just an incredible testament to friendship. It's one of the best things I've ever read about friendship. And friendship between artists is like kind of more intense than normal friendship, I think. And because like if you connect to someone over what they do, and it goes both ways, that can be very powerful in a non-competitive, supportive way. And so then I thought, well, okay, I'm going to interview Ron because he's cool. He's a really interesting guy. He's kind of a character. And what if I combine these two sources to kind of create like to kind of simulate a conversation between these two friends who can't speak anymore. And that conversation doesn't have to be linear. It can kind of jump all over the place and go between the past and the present and mirror the elliptical quality of Joe's poem. And it was hard for me to figure out how to do that, but a sound designer who I collaborated with on Teenage also edited that. And he's a radio producer, so he's really good at storytelling, audio-based storytelling. And then, so that's how that kind of came about. And that film became about friendship, and I'd actually really like to make another film about creative friendship. I'm trying to figure out what that might be, but it's a theme that really interests me.
And was that an installation at any point, or was that like an early concept?
That film was actually commissioned by a museum at Collage in New York, and I installed it in a gallery, which I really liked. And, I'm kind of like my work to be in dialogue with fine artists in the art world, and not just because art and art making is the subject of my work sometimes, but because I'm just interested in that discourse. But it was cool to do that, but beyond that opportunity, it's mostly screened as a short film at festivals. But I'm interested in making work that has a narrative, but that can unfold in an elliptical way in a kind of installation.
It's interesting that it shares that sound design quality with Teenage, because the archival footage is also something that's present in that. Is it like a syphilis documentary that becomes like the avatar for Joe in that?
Yeah, how'd you know that?
Research, the archive.
Oh, really? That's crazy that you knew that. Did I say it somewhere, or did you know that? Oh, okay.
I'm not well acquainted with syphilis.
But there's it's funny because the thing that's crazy is that I've talked about another syphilis documentary from the 20s that I used in a different context, and this is a syphilis documentary from the 50s. But so although maybe the one from the 20s isn't syphilis, it's just sexually transmitted diseases in general. But anyways, off topic. I mean, it's the thing that's cool about a lot of newsreels and public health films is that they're real people from the era, and they're very staged and shot. Let's see, and there's something campy about them. But when you take them out of context, you're seeing real people in the clothes that they actually wore, and they're just covered in kind of wide, medium, and close-up shots. And there was this one color film of this blonde kid who takes a girl out on a date, and they have sex, and he gets syphilis, and then he's walking with his friends, and he's embarrassed to see her, and he doesn't know what to do, and there's a confrontation. He has a meltdown with his doctor. Of course, that's not the I've taken that totally out of context, and he becomes a kind of avatar for Joe, and it's almost like he's, struggling with his sexuality and doesn't feel understood by his peers, and, so I've taken it out of context. But it's fun to kind of re-scramble the meaning, the intended meaning of some of this material, and it's documentary material, even though it's staged, and I make documentaries even though a lot of what I do is very staged and scripted.
It also makes the audience aware that there is this relationship between the audio and the visual that is maybe at some point symbolic or a projection, and that's okay. Like versus the reenactments where we were talking about, some people may get them, people may think they're legit. I think that in this case, people know that it's being kind of ascribed a meaning that wasn't there initially.
And, to me, it's a punk strategy. It's kind of like, Jon, early on when we were working, he talked about in the 70s, punks would take thrift clothes and they would cut them up and reassemble them with safety pins into something new. And he called it living collage, and I thought that was a really beautiful idea, just conceptually, like, what is a living collage? And I said that could be a philosophy for the filmmaking in teenage. You take all these voices and images and clips of youth from previous youth cultures, and you re-scramble them and reassemble them into something that feels new. And it's something that takes place in the past, but it's about the future. And that kind of futuristic thinking is very punk rock, and that kind of collage aesthetic obviously is the iconic punk look. And I don't think about it in theoretical terms, although maybe as a student I would have. Now it's comes kind of second nature in terms of trying to use imagery non-literally. As filmmakers, especially documentary filmmakers, you're often trying to illustrate or cover a scene. So you have this interview with someone, we're talking about blah, 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 and then you want to illustrate it, cover it or if you have a written scene in a script, and you got to cover it with different shots, and it can get very easy to do the literal thing. It's like I'm talking about a bunny, and now we cut to a bunny, or like we got to cover this written scene in like a wide shot, and then 2 close reaction shots, and it's always nice to try to push yourself to think about a way to kind of to not literally illustrate something, but to kind of still activate the idea that's being said, or the dramatic idea that's kind of at the core of a scene. So to me, it's now an intuitive thing. It's like, what imagery do I have at my disposal to cover this scene, but that doesn't feel completely literal,
And we talked about essay films. Is there a point where you're going to maybe inject yourself a little more literally into your films, have it connect more?
I like writing personal essays.
Yeah.
I have no interest in making a personal film in which I'm talking about myself.
Or even just like, like it's implied that things are running through you and your choice of imagery.
Yeah,
and there's that connection with the subject matter, but I was wondering if at any point it would just creep in a little bit more, or...
I don't know. I feel like with teenage, the approach is pretty subjective in general, and that it feels like my hand's heavy on the film. There's definitely a more straightforward way that film could have been made. I don't know who would do it, or how it would be made, or who would make it. But I feel like it's often a balance. I don't want to make my filmmaking choices be about me showing my kind of range. I want to make filmmaking choices often that just serve the subject matter. So actually the Arthur Russell film, originally I conceptualized it in a much more experimental way, and I came to realize, people don't know who Arthur Russell is, and I have a platform now to kind of tell his story and to introduce his work to a broader audience, and that's kind of more important than me kind of like showing the world that I can do this in an experimental way. And some people perhaps perceive that film as having kind of experimental inclinations, but I perceived it as a fairly straightforward and conventionalized film. And whatever, I guess in teenage I did go a little further in terms of stylization, but I felt that the subject matter demanded it in a certain way. If you're going to make a film about teenage, how can you have old people telling you what happened, or historians kind of locking this down? It needs that kind of sense of becoming, and that dreamlike quality makes sense for this subject, and just the kind of that melancholy that some of the actors have feels really true to the kind of emotional experience of growing up in that phase of life.
But on the other hand, it still also has those epigrams, like there is that movement towards more of a objective...
I was trying to do a lot of things, maybe too many things, in that film, but once I was trying to keep the historical context alive, so you know where you are and kind of generally when and what's happening in the bigger world without kind of spoon-feeding general history that people know. Because even if a teenager sees this film, they've been in school and have learned a lot of this general history. I feel like most viewers who will see the film don't need tons of general history context, but some is there to kind of give a sense of time and place. And it was always a balance between giving context and just giving an emotional interpretation of what was happening. And I've definitely leaned more towards the emotional interpretation than the context, but I was always trying to strike a balance. It's a film that in a way I see as kind of overflowing with ideas and kind of imagery and experiences, and I like films like that. I'm drawn to films that are kind of spilling over the edges a little bit.
And that kind of is the ending. It just literally spills over. You have this kind of Brava montage. How hard was that to like narrow down? Like you have this basically everything that's happened since.
Yeah, it was hard. It was hard, but it was kind of intuitive. It was more just like get a bunch of stuff, cut it together, find kind of a visual logic for it, and then start analyzing, well, what about this and this and this and this and this? And it started very political, and that felt like propaganda to me, and I wanted it to be kind of more just partying. But then the kind of oppression stuff needed to be there. It was really, like everything in that film, there's 20 million things that you could have included. And I think that's the hardest part of teenage is there's so much more that potentially could have been included, and it's a kind of film that provokes a viewer to say, but what about this, or what about that? And I think I just had to follow the best material and bring the material I found to life, and to try to tell a story that has a beginning and where there's movement towards an ending, and to do it in a way that I felt would be pleasurable for the viewer. Because oftentimes more intellectually demanding material feels like hard work.
Yeah.
And I think this film is easy to watch. That was a real goal for me.
It's funny you mentioned like you could have chosen so many different things, because watching Arthur Russell, the one thing that comes to mind, because it's a musician, is your soundtrack. Like, what are the Arthur Russell tracks you're going to use? How long are they going to play? And
that was so random how I did that. I would just kind of like, first of all, any filmmaker will tell you, you put like temp music in and then it's just like, it never goes away. Like, and you never want to go away. And when you're putting scoring, you're like, ah. But, you know, it's, for me, it's so random what music I dump into a rough cut. And then I get used to it. And with Arthur Russell, it was totally like that. I was like, this song kind of would feel right here. And it was just super non-precious, intuitively put stuff in and it would stay. And it was towards the end of that film, I remember thinking, well, we need something from this body of work, and we need to strike a kind of balance of all the different kinds of music. But it all begins in a pretty like sloppy, intuitive way for me. And I think it's true for writers too, when you have to just start kind of writing stuff and putting it on a page, and then you start crafting it and picking it apart and analyzing it to death and taking the life out of it and then bringing the life back. That's how I work filmmaking wise too. I just kind of dump a lot out there and then shape. I mean, the analogy that I like to use is it's like a boulder, your topic, and I like to just like explode it into a million little pieces and then really just like anal retentively organize everything until I can like have all my ducks in the line and then take things and kind of put it into a new shape. I mean, that's kind of process-wise in a global sense. That's what I like to do, is to create systems to process like complex narratives and complex information, a lot of material, and then to organize it obsessively and then to kind of reassemble it into something that has a shape and a form, you know.
It also seems like your scope's getting bigger though, just in the subject matter too, right?
Yeah, but I would be happy to make a film about a tiny little subject next. I mean, the way I work is there's some continuity in what I'm doing. I guess I'm searching to describe it right now. But overall, I feel like I'm interested in going in radically different directions for each film. The Joe Brainard film is kind of like a bridge from Wild Combination to this. It's a queer biography, but it's comprised of archival imagery of teenagers and youth, and it's driven by a separate audio kind of track that has a kind of loose lyrical feeling to it. I mean, those things, I guess there's always threads in people's work, but my goal would be to do something completely unexpected for myself when I make my next film. It won't be a cultural history of teenagers. It won't deal with youth culture. I think it will be something totally different.
The elderly?
Yeah, it'll be about old people.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Yeah, thanks. Cool. I was talking about all sorts of shit. I hope it was relevant. But
no, it's all great.
Oh, cool.